He repaired the Queen's ship for free, unaware she'd been testing potential husbands. The warning light on the distress beacon had been blinking for 6 minutes when Calvin Reyes decided he was going to do something about it. He was elbow-deep in a coolant manifold, floating 300 meters above the docking ring of Haveth Station, a rusted skeleton of a spaceport that sat at the edge of charted territory like a forgotten nail in the wall of the universe. The station smelled of old metal and recycled air. Its halls were cramped, its vendors shady, and its politics were the sort that made a quiet man's skin crawl. Calvin had been here for 2 weeks, doing freelance repair work on whatever broke down and whoever could pay him. That was his life. Simple, low drama. The distress signal was coming from a ship parked in the restricted bay, the bay that was not restricted by any station authority, but by the sheer presence of the vessel docked inside it. He had noticed the ship the moment he arrived. Everyone had. It was a Velhari cruiser, long and white as bone, carved in the sweeping geometric patterns that the Velhari considered both decoration and engineering. Most species had never seen one up close. Velhari rarely left their sector. Velhari royalty never did. Calvin wiped his hands on his work rag and floated over to his small console. He pulled up the beacon code and cross-referenced it with the station frequency index. The signal was not a station alarm. It was internal. The ship itself was broadcasting. Whatever was wrong was happening from the inside out. He looked around the empty maintenance corridor. No one else was near. The docking bay's other mechanics had cleared out the moment the ship arrived, spooked by the emblem on its hull. Calvin had seen that emblem before in an old trade archive, the mark of the Velhari royal house. He told himself he was only going to look. He pushed off the wall and kicked gently through the corridor, following the beacon ping on his wrist scanner. His magnetic boots clicked softly against the floor as he descended into the lower docking ring. The Velhari ship loomed ahead, filling the entire bay. Up close, the hull patterns were not just decorative. They were load-bearing seams, pressure channels, resonance guides. Whoever designed this thing understood materials science the way a poet understands language. Calvin ran 2 fingers along one of the channels without meaning to. Old habit. You could read a ship's engineering philosophy by the way its surfaces were finished. This one had been built by people who believed in the thing they were making. There was a crack running along the starboard exhaust coupling, a long, ugly crack that no amount of patchwork would fix. The coupling had sheared under stress, probably during a hard deceleration that came in too fast against a gravity well. The crystal lining inside, and Calvin could see the glint of it through the break, had fractured as well. Without that lining intact, the ship was not going anywhere. The entire propulsion sequence would collapse inward the moment it was engaged, and the resulting pressure cascade would do far worse damage than the crack. He stood there for a long time, scanner running. Then he went back to his workshop. He was not being heroic. He told himself that clearly and with some force as he pulled his crystal bonding kit from the 3rd shelf and checked his stock of Haveth-grade filament solder. He had enough. He also had a pressure-formed coupling sleeve that he had fabricated last month for a freighter job that fell through because the client ran out of money. The sleeve had been sitting there since then, taking up shelf space. It was not a perfect fit. Velhari Engineering used a slightly different thread pitch than anything on the commercial market. But he had a lathe, and he had time, and the crack was not going to fix itself. He pulled out the sleeve and examined it under his work light. Titanium alloy body, standard tolerance. He could rethread it on the manual lathe to match the Velhari pitch, but that was going to take at least an hour of careful work. The crystal lining was a bigger problem. He had bonding compound, but the Velhari crystal resonance signature was specific. He would need to read the hull seam to calibrate the compound before each bonding pass. Otherwise, the repair would hold for about 2 weeks and then delaminate under thermal cycling. He read the hull seam. He went back to his workbench and mixed the first batch of compound. 4 hours later, he was back at the ship. His shoulders ached from the lathe work. His coffee had gone cold 90 minutes ago and he had forgotten to reheat it. He set up his work light, anchored his tool kit to the hull magnetically, and began the repair. The crack required 3 separate bonding passes, each one cured under heat before the next could begin. The coupling sleeve had to be torqued by hand because the Velhari thread pitch interacted badly with powered drivers. He had figured that out by reading the stress pattern on the original brake, which showed micro-rotation damage consistent with power tool use on an incompatible thread. He replaced the crystal lining in sections, fusing each piece with a technique he had learned from a Drenathi glassworker named Paro 6 years ago on Sethai Station, a technique that most human mechanics had never heard of, and that took an embarrassingly long time to explain because the underlying physics was counterintuitive. The compound did not fill the gap, it grew across it. Given the right thermal gradient and the right resonance seed, it crystallized outward from both edges simultaneously and met in the middle with a joint that was structurally stronger than either parent surface. He did not explain this to anyone, he just did it. 3 hours of careful work, pass by pass, each bead of solder laid down with the steadiness of someone who had done this particular quality of work for so long that his hands knew the motions without being told. When the last bead cooled and he ran his scanner over the coupling, the reading came back clean. Better than clean, the resonance profile of the repaired section was stronger than the surrounding hull, because the bonding compound had filled micro-fractures that predated the main crack by what looked like a full service cycle. The ship would hold, more than hold. It would be better here than it had been. He packed his tools, retrieved his magnet anchors, and turned to leave. A panel in the hull slid open. Light spilled out, pale and blue-white, the particular shade the Velhari used for interior lighting, not quite like any human light source, a little cooler, a little more complete across the spectrum. And in the opening stood a figure that Calvin's brain took a full 3 seconds to correctly process. She was tall, most Velhari were. Her skin was a deep silver gray, and her eyes were the color of light through old glass. Amber layered over gold layered over something that had no name in any human language Calvin knew. She wore a garment that was simple in the way that a cathedral is simple, technically just walls and a roof, but assembled with a precision that made everything else in the room feel unfinished. Around her throat was a chain bearing a single stone that Calvin recognized from the same trade archive, where he had seen the royal emblem. That stone, in the archive, had been described in careful language as something worn only by the reigning head of the Velhari dominion. He stared at her. She looked at the repaired coupling, then at him, then at the coupling again. Her expression was unreadable in the way that deep water is unreadable, not because there is nothing there, but because what is there is very far below the surface, and the surface is perfectly still. "You repaired my ship," she said. Her voice was low and precise, each word placed like a careful step on uncertain ground. Calvin looked at the coupling, then at her. "The crack was going to take out your whole propulsion stack if you tried to burn hard," he said. "I had the parts. You had Drenathi crystal bonding compound. I picked things up." She was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was not uncomfortable, but it was absolute, the way the quiet in deep space is absolute. Then she said, "What is your price?" He thought about it honestly, the way he always thought about prices, materials, labor, time, the inconvenience factor, risk premium for working on a vessel he had no authorization to touch. He had spent 4 hours and used about 60 credits of materials, plus the coupling sleeve, which he had been planning to repurpose for something else anyway. "Nothing," he said. She blinked. It was the first time her face had changed at all. "Nothing," she repeated, and the word came out with the flatness of something that did not compute. "You were stranded," he said simply, "and I could fix it, that's reason enough." He picked up his kit and walked back toward his workshop, because he had 3 other jobs waiting and a coolant manifold that was not going to reassemble itself, and he had already been gone longer than planned. What he did not see, could not have seen, because he was already moving down the corridor and did not look back, was the expression on her face as she watched him go. It was not the look of a monarch who had received a service. It was something older than that and more careful, the look of someone who had been searching for a very long time and had just, unexpectedly, found something they had started to believe did not exist. Behind her, in the shadowed interior of the ship, a second figure stepped forward, an advisor older, her silver hair pulled tight in the formal style, her expression caught between genuine shock and something that looked like the first relaxing of a tension she had been holding for a long time. "Well," the advisor said quietly in the Velhari court tongue, "that is the 7th question answered." The queen said nothing, but she did not go back inside. She stood in the open panel and watched the direction Calvin had gone, long after the sound of his boots on the corridor floor had faded, until the blue-white light behind her cast her shadow long and thin across the docking bay floor, and the repaired coupling hummed cleanly beside her, warm from the bonding process, solid as something new. Calvin's workshop was a 12 by 18-foot room on the lower ring of Haveth Station that smelled permanently of solder flux and machine oil. He had rented it for 3 months and intended to leave after 2, but a series of decently paying repair jobs had kept him anchored here longer than he planned. He did not mind. Movement was his natural state. He had been to 11 stations and 4 planets in the last 3 years, but stillness had its uses. He thought more clearly when he was working in one place. His hands knew where everything was. He could move from problem to solution without the friction of an unfamiliar workspace. He was halfway through reassembling the coolant manifold when he heard boots in the corridor outside. Not the soft, magnetic click of a station worker or the heavier thud of cargo crew. These were deliberate, measured footsteps, the kind made by someone who was accustomed to having space cleared ahead of them, and who moved through a room the same way whether or not that was happening. He kept working. The door opened without a knock. He looked up. It was not the queen. It was the older woman he had glimpsed in the ship's doorway, the one whose expression had shifted when Calvin declined payment. She stepped inside and looked around the workshop with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional appraisal, which, he would understand later, was exactly what she was doing. "I am Counselor Verath," she said, "first advisor to Her Luminance, Queen Silene of the Velhari Dominion." Calvin set down his torque wrench. "Calvin Reyes," he said, "independent mechanic." "I know who you are," Verath said. "We ran your records 40 minutes ago." She paused. "You have no criminal history. Your tax filings are current and accurate. You hold a certificate of excellence from the Drenathi Technical Institute, which is not issued lightly. You have 17 documented successful repairs on vessels that other certified mechanics declared structurally unsalvageable." 18 now, Calvin said. He picked up the torque wrench and went back to the manifold. Verath watched him for a moment. There was nothing impatient about her watching. She was simply observing, the way someone observes a machine they are deciding whether to trust. "You did not ask for payment," she said. "Your queen already covered that." "I am covering it again," Verath said, "because it is remarkable. In our experience, people do not repair things without expecting something in return." Calvin did not look up from the manifold. "In your experience, maybe. I fixed a broken ship because it needed fixing and I could do it. I'm not looking for a reward. If the Queen wants to do something generous, there are 3 relief funds operating on the station level. Any of them would use the contribution better than I would." Verath was quiet for so long that he actually looked up to check if she had left. She had not. She was standing in the same position, watching him with an expression he could not quite name, intent, evaluating, and somewhere beneath both of those things, something that looked almost like relief. "The Queen would like to speak with you," Verath said. Calvin thought about his manifold. He thought about the 3 other jobs queued after it. He thought about the fact that turning down a queen was probably unwise and that he was, if he was honest with himself, genuinely curious about what she wanted to say. Not in the way of someone attracted to power. He found power mostly exhausting to be near, but in the way of a person who had seen something unusual and wanted to understand it better. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. "I need to finish this valve section or the seal compound will dry wrong and I'll have to restart it." Verath blinked. No one made a queen wait 10 minutes. The concept had not encountered her before, and she was visibly processing it. "Of course," she said, and she stood there and waited. He finished the section. He cleaned his hands with the specific care of someone who has learned that the detail of clean hands matters more than people acknowledge. He walked with Verath back through the lower ring of the station, past vendors who watched but did not speak, past other mechanics who had noticed the Velhari advisor and were now trying to figure out who Calvin was, past a group of children chasing something small and fast that had escaped from a cargo container. The Velhari cruiser in its bay was still the most extraordinary piece of engineering on the station. Calvin looked at the starboard coupling as they approached. The repair was holding well. He could see the slight color difference where the bonding compound had set. It would fade in about a month. Inside the ship, the Queen was in a room that was both less and more formal than he had expected. The furnishings were spare and exact, pale materials, clean geometry. A carafe of something amber sat on a low table, and 2 cups had been set out. She was seated at the table, and she gestured at the second cup when he sat, which he did without being formally invited because no one had told him not to. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You did not ask for payment," she said. "Still true," he agreed. "Why?" He looked at the cup for a moment, not avoiding the question, but treating it as a real question that deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. "Because the job needed doing and I could do it. Because the alternative was watching a ship sit broken while the owner waited for someone to calculate whether it was worth their time. That bothers me. Things that can be fixed should be fixed." "It's not complicated." "Most people find it complicated," she said. "Most people are thinking about the wrong part of it," he said. She studied him. "Where did you learn the Drenathi crystal bonding technique? It is not taught outside the Drenathi technical academies." "A glassworker named Paro on Sethai Station. About 6 years back. I traded 2 months of hull maintenance work for the method. Then it took another 4 months of practice to adapt it for metal crystal interfaces because the thermal gradient is different and you have to compensate at the seed stage or the crystallization front runs unevenly." He paused. "Most people think it is overcomplicated. It is not overcomplicated. It is just slow, which most people do not like." "You are patient," she said. "When it matters," he said, "not always." Something shifted in her expression, not dramatically, not the way expressions shift in stories when a moment arrives. It was very quiet, the way the quality of light changes in the hour before dawn if you are actually paying attention rather than just looking. "The Velhari Dominion is currently without a royal consort," she said. "It has been 7 years since my predecessor's rule ended and I took the throne. In that time, I have evaluated 43 candidates put forward by allied houses and member worlds of the Dominion. Each was measured against a set of criteria that the Royal Council helped to establish. Not one has met all of them." She paused. "Not a single one." Calvin looked at her steadily. He had a feeling he knew where this conversation was going, and he was not sure yet how he felt about it. He decided to wait and hear more before deciding. "I did not come to Haveth Station only for refueling," she said. "The coupling damage was real. I would not manufacture a fault in my own ship's propulsion system. There are too many ways that goes wrong. But the decision to stop here was not only logistical. I was told by someone I trust that this station is a place where character can be observed plainly. The people here have real problems, real needs. There is no political performance happening in these corridors. What you see is what is there." She looked at him directly. "You were the 14th person to detect the distress beacon." 14th, he said. The number landed unexpectedly. The first 13 noticed the signal. Each of them made a calculation. Some weighed the risk of engaging with a royal vessel without authorization. Some did not have the required skill. Some had the skill but opened with questions about the compensation before they had even looked at the damage. Two simply walked away. Her voice was even throughout this, but there was something underneath it that he was beginning to hear, not bitterness exactly, because bitterness requires surprise, and she had clearly been doing this long enough that surprise was no longer available to her. It was something more like the long, accumulated weight of knowing exactly how most things end before they begin. You did not calculate. You looked at the beacon, you went to your workshop, you got your tools, and you came back. Calvin was quiet for a moment, and the repair technique itself. There are, to our knowledge, 3 practitioners in this sector who understand the Drenathi bonding method well enough to apply it correctly to Velhari hull materials. You are one of them. The other 2 were also present on the station when the beacon activated. She met his eyes. Neither of them came. He sat with that for a moment. Then, what were the criteria, the ones from the council? She considered the question. 7 criteria. Each one a quality that my predecessor's most successful consort embodied, and that the historical record suggests is more predictive of a lasting and effective partnership than lineage, political training, or status. They are not spectacular qualities. They are ordinary qualities made reliable by consistency. Tell me what they are, he said. She told him, one by one, clearly, without embellishment. He listened the same way he listened to a client describe a fault he had not yet seen completely, without interrupting, storing each detail precisely. When she finished, he was quiet again. He picked up the cup of amber liquid and drank a small amount. It tasted like something between honey and open space, warm at the first touch, then vast in the way that very old things are vast. I should be honest with you about something, he said. Please, she said. I don't know anything about Velhari politics. Not really. The archive I read was old and probably incomplete. That is actually useful, she said. The people who know Velhari politics thoroughly are almost uniformly exhausting to spend time with. That surprised him into something close to a smile. I'm also not ceremonially trained. I'll say the wrong thing at formal events. I'll miss which gesture means what and which silence means something. My senior advisor is exceptionally skilled at navigating exactly that, she said. She would be beside you for every formal function. I have a contract repair job starting in 3 weeks on Sethai Station, he said. Sethai Station is within Velhari jurisdictional reach. That repair can be completed by a licensed yard crew within 2 days. The outcome would be identical. He looked at her carefully. That's not really my concern. I know, she said, and the honesty in it was immediate and undefended. I am not trying to solve you the way I solve logistics. I am telling you that the practical obstacles are manageable. I am not, however, in a position to manage the other thing because the other thing is not mine to manage. What's the other thing? She looked at him steadily. Whether a person who does what needs doing, not for recognition, not for reward, not because anyone is watching, whether that person might want to spend time with someone who has spent 7 years in a position where almost nothing is done without calculation, and who has become very tired of it. Calvin Reyes thought about this. He thought about it honestly, which meant he thought about what it would actually look like rather than what it might look like in a story. He thought about his workshop. He thought about his schedule. He thought about the coolant manifold that was properly sealed now and the 3 jobs after it. He thought about the way she had looked at him when she said she had become tired of it. It was not the look of someone asking for sympathy. It was the look of someone stating a precise and true thing. He refilled his cup. She did not stop him, and he noticed that she also refilled her own. Tell me more about the criteria, he said. All 7 from the beginning. And Queen Silene of the Velhari Dominion, who had spent 7 years watching carefully prepared candidates perform versions of themselves at a distance she could not cross, leaned forward and began to speak as though she were talking to someone real. Because she was. The conversation lasted 3 hours. When Calvin left, he walked back to his workshop, sat down at his bench, and stared at the coolant manifold for a while without touching it. Then he picked up his tools and finished the job, because it was there and it needed doing. But his mind was elsewhere for most of it, turning something over and over, looking at it from different angles the way he looked at a new kind of fault, carefully, without assumptions, trying to understand what was actually there before deciding what to do about it. 3 days after that first conversation, Calvin was still on Havath Station. He had not intended to be. He had started packing his kit on the morning of the second day, gotten as far as folding his second set of work clothes, and then set them down and gone back to work on a broken water recycler for a family in the residential block on level 3. The recycler took 6 hours to diagnose and repair properly, because the fault was in 3 interconnected places and fixing only one would have had the other 2 fail within a week. He charged them cost of parts only. He told himself he was not staying because of the Queen. That would have been impractical and slightly absurd, and Calvin Reyes was neither of those things as a rule. He was staying because the station had work, and because he had not finished deciding anything yet. But he went back to the Velhari cruiser that evening. He knocked on the hull panel. Old habit, you knocked before entering someone's space. Verath opened it. She looked at him, then at the absence of any formal offering in his hands, and something he could only interpret as approval settled briefly in her expression before her face returned to its default of professional neutrality. The Queen was in the same room as before, but she was not at the table. She was standing at a narrow viewport, looking out at the station's exterior scaffolding with the focused stillness of someone who was genuinely looking at something rather than just standing. She turned when he came in. "You stayed," she said. "There was a repair job," he said. "Water recycler on level 3. "The Okura family," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "We have been observing the station for context. It is how I work." "You charged them below your standard rate." "Standard rate assumes tools plus time. Their situation only needed time. It would have felt dishonest to charge the full figure." She sat at the table. He sat across from her again, same as before, same unannounced comfort with the informality of it. She seemed to not merely tolerate this but to actually prefer it, which fit with what he was beginning to understand about her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "The 43 candidates. What happened to them after you made your decision?" She considered the question carefully, which he had come to realize was not caution but her natural pace. She thought about things before she said them, and she said them exactly as she meant them. They returned to their home worlds. Some made strong political matches afterward. Some entered service in other roles. A few I am still on reasonably good terms with diplomatically. None were harmed by the process. And if you select someone who the council has not approved. Her eyes were very steady when she answered. Then I manage that. I have governed for 9 years. I have managed trade collapse, drought, territorial disputes, and a succession crisis that my council allowed to drag while they argued procedure. A personnel disagreement within the council is not something I would find difficult. "You have managed harder things," he said. "Much harder," she said, not with pride, simply with accuracy. Calvin nodded. He was reading her the way he read damaged equipment, looking not at what it was saying, but at what the damage pattern revealed about the forces that had been applied to it over time. What the pattern told him was that she was not fragile, and she was not performing toughness either. She had simply been under real load for a long time and had held her shape. "I'm going to say the wrong thing at formal dinners," he said again. He seemed to feel this needed establishing in multiple conversations. "You have said so. I mean that I am genuinely going to do it. It is not modesty. I will use the wrong form of address. I will probably ask what something means while it is happening rather than afterward. I will be thinking about whether the ventilation in the room is running correctly. when I should be listening to a speech. The corner of her mouth moved again, adjacent to a smile not quite there. The consort 3 generations back once repaired the ceremonial fountain in the central palace court because it was losing pressure, she said. He used a bonding material that turned the water blue. The court was initially appalled. Within a season it had been declared a new tradition. The fountain has been blue ever since. Calvin looked at her. How old was he when he did that? 26. He came from a small outer colony. He had no formal training and no interest in acquiring any. She paused. He and the Queen at that time were together for 41 years. Their partnership is described in the historical record as the most stable reign in 3 centuries. What did he do, with his time, I mean? He built things, she said simply. He built a school in the 2nd year, then a water system for a region that had been in drought, then a hospital in the outer districts. He was considered quite terrible at diplomacy and quite exceptional at identifying what was actually wrong and then actually fixing it. He sounds like someone I would have liked, Calvin said. I have been thinking about him a great deal recently, she said, since the search began. None of the 43 reminded you of him. They were all trying to be impressive, she said. He was not trying to be anything. He was simply himself, consistently, in public and in private, in front of the council and in the engine room of a broken transport. That consistency is rarer than it sounds. Calvin sat with that for a moment. The word consistently did something specific in his mind. He tested it against himself without ceremony in front of people alone, when someone was watching when no one was. Whether he would have fixed the coupling if he had known who owned the ship. He thought honestly about that question, and the answer was yes, which was either a virtue or simply a character trait, and either way it was true. What would this actually look like, he said. Set aside the ceremony and the politics. What is the real shape of it? She thought about this with the same care she brought to every question he had asked. It would look like work, she said. There are 11 worlds in the Dominion. Every one of them has infrastructure that is aging, systems that are failing, technical problems that the local crews are trying to manage without sufficient knowledge or resources. It would look like traveling to those places and doing what you do, not as a symbol. As an actual mechanic with access to better supply lines and better information than any independent contractor currently has. And the palace side of it. I handle the palace side of it, she said. I am not looking for a co-ruler. I have advisors for the governance. I have counselors for the politics. What I do not have is someone who will tell me when I am wrong about something, who will care about the actual result of a decision rather than the appearance of the decision, who will sit across from me at the end of a difficult day and be genuinely present rather than strategically present. She said this without self-pity and without drama. She said it the way she said everything, as an accurate account of a real situation. I'm not going to be very good at being strategically present, Calvin said. I know, she said, that is the point. He turned the cup in his hands. The amber liquid caught the pale light from the viewport. I have conditions, he said. Her attention sharpened, not with alarm but with interest. Tell me. I keep the actual work. Not symbolic visits to infrastructure projects where I stand next to something being fixed by someone else. I get in the system, diagnose it myself, and fix what I can fix. If something requires a larger crew, I coordinate that crew and I am part of it. Agreed without reservation. I am not going to learn the formal court language. I will be respectful to everyone I meet. I will not be careless or rude. But if I use the wrong honorific, that is not worth a diplomatic incident. Verath will walk beside you at every formal function. She has smoothed worse. I want access to the real maintenance data from all 11 worlds, not summaries prepared for council meetings, the actual numbers. I will have Verath compile them before we leave this station, she said. He nodded slowly. One more thing. Yes. If I think something is wrong with a decision, with a direction, with the way something is being handled, I am going to say so. Not publicly and not unkindly, but I am going to say it. Silene looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very even, but he had learned to hear what was underneath it. That, she said, is not a condition. That is a requirement. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. The station hummed around them. Somewhere in the lower ring, he could hear the intermittent pressure flutter of a pipe system that had a developing fault he had noticed 2 days ago and been meaning to address. The pipe system on level 4, he said. There is an intermittent pressure issue. It has the signature of a weakening regulator seal. It will fail inside a week if no one gets to it. She looked at him for a moment, that focused, complete attention. Then, I will have Verath note it for the station maintenance team. I'll go in the morning and do it myself, he said, before we talk more, if that is acceptable. It is acceptable, she said. He stood. She did not try to extend the evening, and he noticed that he respected this. She was not trying to hold him, not performing warmth as a strategy. She was simply present when he was there and not grasping when he was not. He walked to the door. In the corridor outside, Verath was standing precisely where she should have been, doing nothing with the accomplished stillness of someone who is always exactly where they are needed. There is an 8th criterion, Verath said quietly as he passed. He stopped. What is it? Knowing when to leave without being pressed to do so, she said. You have just passed it. Calvin Reyes walked back through Haveth Station toward his workshop. He repaired the level 4 pipe system the following morning, which took 90 minutes and required a regulator seal he had in stock and a tool fit for the specific fitting type, which not many mechanics carried. He charged the station nothing because the work took less than 2 hours and the seal cost him 6 credits. Then he went back to the Velhari cruiser. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, 2 people who were both extremely practical and extremely honest had come to an understanding that had very little formality in it and a great deal of truth. And Calvin Reyes told himself that this was either the most logical decision he had ever made or the least logical one. And then he decided that the distinction did not matter very much. He was going to do it because it was in front of him, and because it needed doing, and because, for the first time in a long time, the broken thing he was looking at was not a machine. The announcement did not go well. Calvin found this out the same way he found out most things, by being in the room when it happened, paying careful attention, and making no assumptions based on what he expected. He was standing in the main formal chamber of the Velhari Royal Council on Velhari Prime, when 15 senior advisors received the news that Queen Silene had selected a royal consort. He watched the careful diplomatic mask slip off 14 of those 15 faces with the specific speed of people who had not prepared for this answer. The one who kept his expression completely neutral was a very old counselor named Var-Eseth, whose silver hair and slow movements concealed a political mind that had survived 6 changes of administration by the simple method of never reacting to anything faster than a full sentence had been spoken. Calvin had been briefed on him by Verath. He had been briefed on all of them, in a 2-hour session that morning that Verath delivered with the precision of someone who had spent decades distilling complex systems into usable information. Calvin had listened completely and asked 3 questions at the end. Verath had described these questions afterward, to Silene, as precisely the right 3 questions. The other 14 counselors were less composed than Var-Eseth. There were questions about lineage, delivered with the careful phrasing of people who knew they could not directly say what they were thinking. There were questions about political alliances, which house, which world, what strategic benefit accrued to the Dominion. There were questions, worded delicately, about whether a human could understand the weight and implication of the role. One counselor, younger than the others and bearing the polished look of someone who had been strategically positioned for advancement and expected this moment to be part of that advancement, asked directly, and without complete delicacy, whether the decision had been made under unusual emotional circumstances. Selene let 3 seconds pass before she answered. The 3 seconds were deliberate. Calvin noticed them. "I have governed 11 worlds for 9 years," she said, in a voice that was not raised and not cold. "Every decision of consequence I have made in that time has been made carefully, with full information, and in the interest of the Dominion. If you are formally questioning my judgment, state it plainly and accept the protocol consequences of that statement. If you are not, then I suggest we proceed to practical matters." The young counselor moved to practical matters. Calvin stood slightly to the side of center, where he preferred to be in any room, and said nothing. Varath was beside him, close enough that if he missed a cue she could provide it without being noticed. She provided too. He caught both. After the session, which resolved nothing formally but established the political terrain clearly enough that Varath pronounced it a reasonable outcome, Calvin walked with Selene along the long corridor connecting the council wing to the private sections of the palace. He had been on Velhari Prime for 4 days now. The planet was remarkable in ways he was still cataloging, architecture that looked like it had been coaxed into shape rather than built, a sky with 2 moons that moved in different directions at noticeably different speeds, a city of 6 million that ran with a kind of civic quiet he had not encountered anywhere else. "That went badly," he said. "It went as expected," she said. "Varesith will carry 8 votes when he decides to use them. He will decide to use them. Councillor Drevin, the one who questioned my reasoning, will mount a formal opposition and lose it within 60 days. The remaining 12 are observing to determine whether you are a liability." "How do I address that?" "By being what you are," she said. "Without modification. The council deals in performance constantly. Authenticity is not something they have a reliable defense against because they rarely encounter it." He thought about that. What about the public? "The Velhari public responds to evidence over time," she said. "They are skeptical by nature and not particularly impressed by titles or lineage on their own. If you do your work and do it visibly, and do not pretend to be something other than what you are, they will reach their own conclusions." "That sounds like it takes a while." "It does," she said. "Most things worth having do." They were passing through a wide vaulted space near the end of the corridor, a utility hub for the palace's environmental systems, tucked behind decorative paneling that was not quite hiding it. Calvin had found it on his first walk through the palace 3 days ago and had spent 20 minutes reading the external monitoring displays. He stopped walking. "The condensation recyclers on this floor," he said. "They are running at about 85% of rated capacity. Based on the pattern, I think the inlet filter matrix is partially clogged. It has been pulling extra load from the secondary cooling system for roughly 6 weeks. Selene stopped beside him. "How do you know the duration?" The wear pattern on the secondary intake manifold showed compensatory stress loading. That kind of wear accumulates at a predictable rate in this class of system. He studied the maintenance hub door. "If you have access to the operational log, I could confirm it, but I am fairly confident." The palace maintenance team reported no issues at the last inspection. "They are probably doing the inspection correctly but not cross-referencing against baseline readings. You would need someone who knows what the baseline should be." He looked at her. "I can fix it this afternoon. 2 hours, maybe less. I just need access and a maintenance kit." She looked at him for a moment. "You are 2 days away from the formal recognition ceremony." "Yes," he agreed. "And the recyclers will still be clogged during the ceremony if no one addresses them. It will not affect the ceremony, but it will affect the cooling load in the West Wing for however long the fault persists, which at current trajectory is another 3 to 4 weeks before the secondary system starts showing strain indicators." She studied him, not with exasperation, not with the particular look he had seen on the faces of people who found practicality inappropriate in formal settings, with the same focused attention she gave to things she found genuinely useful. "I will have a maintenance kit brought to you," she said. He went to work. The fault was exactly what he had suspected. The inlet filter matrix was blocked at 2 of 3 stages, restricting airflow and forcing the downstream system to compensate. He cleaned and reseated the filters, recalibrated the intake pressure settings against the specification panel mounted inside the access hatch, and documented the adjusted readings for the maintenance team. While he worked, Vareth came by with food on a small tray, sat on a storage crate, and ate her own portion without making unnecessary conversation. He found this restful. At the 3-hour mark, the recyclers came back to full rated output. The secondary cooling load dropped immediately, and Calvin could see the pressure gauges stabilize in real time. Vareth looked at the gauges. "The ceremonial staff will find this undignified," she said pleasantly. "The ceremonial staff's cooling system is working correctly now," he said. "Both of those things are true simultaneously," she said, and ate another piece of whatever she was eating. The formal recognition ceremony 2 days later was long, precise, and conducted in the Velhari court tongue at a register that Calvin followed at roughly 70% comprehension. Vareth had prepared him with 2 coaching sessions, each about 90 minutes, and she delivered the preparation the same way she delivered everything, without unnecessary padding, with genuine usefulness in every sentence. He had learned the required responses, the required movements, the correct positions at the correct moments. He delivered them with the steady attention he brought to a complicated repair, not perfectly but correctly, without panic when he momentarily lost the sequence, and had to ask Vareth quietly in plain language what came next. The council, he was told afterward by Var-Resith, had found that moment unexpectedly reassuring. A person who asked clearly what they needed to know, rather than guessing and performing confidence, was a person who could be worked with. "Councillor Dreven's opposition vote," Calvin said to Var-Resith, after the older man shared this observation. "The coalition he is building, will it hold?" Var-Resith examined him with the specific interest of someone who has spent decades cataloging human behavior and has just encountered a new variation. "It will attempt to hold for some weeks. I believe it will collapse. Dreven requires 4 votes from colleagues who are pragmatic people. They will observe you. They will conclude you are not a liability." He paused. "My recommendation, for whatever use it may be, is to remain precisely what you are. Dreven has no political counter to authenticity. He has counters to everything else." "Silene told me the same thing," Calvin said. "Her luminance has very good judgment," Var-Resith said. "It is why she is still queen after 9 years. That evening, Calvin spent an hour in the maintenance hub writing documentation for the palace maintenance team, not just the record of the repair, but a practical guide to the condensation recycler system, including the baseline readings they should be comparing against, the inspection intervals the manufacturer originally specified, the early indicators of a developing clog, and the correct calibration sequence after filter service. He wrote it in plain language, the kind that someone with standard training could use without additional instruction. He was not there to be needed for this. He was there to make it so that no one needed him for this. Silene found him near the end, reading back over the document. "You are writing a maintenance manual," she said. "A practical guide for this specific system," he said. "The team is capable. They just need the right reference. If I fix something and then leave without documenting it, that is only half a fix." She stood beside him and read over several pages. He watched her read, the same focused attention she brought to everything, the same quality of being genuinely present rather than performing presence. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, not heavily, not dramatically, just there for a moment, a true thing placed honestly. "There are 11 worlds," he said. "Yes," she said. "All of them have systems that need maintaining." "Yes. I am going to need a ship with good range, and a parts account with actual depth to it." "You will have both," she said. "And I want to start with the outer colonies. They are the furthest from the supply lines." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but taking the time to understand why he had said that. He could see the moment she did. "Because they have been doing without the longest," she said. "Yes," he said. She sat beside him at the work table. He moved the documentation to make space. They sat there in the pale light of the maintenance hub, the recyclers humming evenly behind them, and for a while neither of them said anything. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had found, without entirely expecting to, that being in the same room as each other was something that cost nothing and returned a great deal. "I am going to say the wrong thing at the reception tomorrow," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "I may also accidentally say something right." "I am counting on it," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The two moons of Velhari Prime moved in their different paths outside the viewport, one slower, one faster, neither paying attention to the other, both exactly where they were meant to be. 6 months after the coupling repair on Havath Station, Calvin Reyes was in the engine room of a Velhari agricultural transport on a small outer colony called Death's Landing, and the chief engineer was explaining that the thermal regulation system had been misfiring for 3 consecutive growing seasons, and that 2 harvest shipments had been delayed, and that the colony's trade balance was suffering in ways that were beginning to affect the families who lived there. The chief engineer's name was Sarev. She was compact and direct, spoke in the outer colony dialect that clipped the formal endings off most words, and she was watching Calvin with the specific skepticism of a skilled person, waiting to see whether the title that had been announced before his arrival was going to result in useful behavior or ceremonial observation. He looked at the thermal relay for 30 seconds. Then he said, "The bypass configuration on this relay type is counterintuitive. Most engineers try to reduce the load when it misfires. That makes it worse." Sarev said nothing. "You need to briefly increase the load to reset the calibration state, and then reduce it with a specific ramp rate. About 3% per second until you reach 60%, and then hold there until the regulation cycle resets." He looked at her. "Do you have manual load control from this panel?" She handed him the panel without a word. He ran the sequence. The thermal regulation graph on her handheld device went from the jagged, irregular trace that meant trouble to a smooth, even line. He watched it settle and then checked the load reading at the primary coupling. Sarev stared at the graph for several seconds. "Who taught you that?" she said. "I worked it out on a different relay type about 7 years ago. This model uses the same underlying architecture, just a different casing. Same fault, same solution. The company that manufactures this unit told us to replace the entire assembly." "The assembly is fine," he said. "The configuration was wrong from the factory settings. If you had replaced it, the replacement would have had the same problem within a season because the factory default is wrong for this class of thermal load." Sarev looked at the graph again, then at Calvin, then at the graph. "You are the royal consort," she said. "Yes." "Why are you here?" "Because the thermal system was misfiring and I knew how to fix it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone recalibrating an expectation. "In my experience, people with titles come to observe things being fixed by other people." "I'm not good at observing," he said. "It makes me anxious." The corner of her mouth moved. "Show me the ramp sequence again," she said. "In detail. I want to be able to run it myself." He showed her, 3 times at her request, until she could run it without reference to him. He also wrote it down in the inspection log in plain language with the specific numbers annotated. Then she showed him the rest of the ship, and he found 3 additional issues that had been on the maintenance list for months. A pump bearing running rough on the secondary water system, a pressure seal on the cargo hold that was beginning to leak slowly, and an electrical ground fault in the navigation backup system that had not yet caused a problem but would, given time and vibration. He addressed all 3 before they left the engine room. The bearing was a straightforward replacement. The seal was a two-compound repair. The ground fault required tracing the circuit by hand to find the chafed insulation, and Serev held the light while he worked. And by the time they were done, she was talking to him the way she talked to a colleague she trusted, quickly, technically, assuming he could follow, occasionally finishing his sentences with the right word when he paused. He could follow. He finished his own sentences, usually, but he appreciated that she tried. Outside, in Death's Landing's main square, Queen Silene was meeting with the Colonial Council about 3 years of difficult harvests and the infrastructure needs that accompanied them. She had her senior advisors with her, a full briefing package, and the kind of preparation that 9 years of governance had made automatic. But she was also genuinely listening, in the way Calvin had come to recognize as specific to her, not the listening of someone waiting for enough information to respond, but the listening of someone who wanted to understand what was actually true. When Calvin came to find her 3 hours later, she looked at his hands, faintly marked with thermal compound and something dark that was either pump grease or the bearing material. He had not entirely identified it, and she said nothing about it. In Velhari body language, this was the equivalent of a deliberate acknowledgement. He had learned this from Verath. He noticed it each time. "How is the colony?" he asked. "It is difficult here," she said quietly. 3 consecutive poor seasons. The transport system is their main connection to trade markets. When it has been unreliable, the economic effect has compounded." She paused. "How is the ship?" "The thermal regulation system will not misfire again. Serev can reset it herself now if the calibration drifts. I also addressed a pump bearing, a cargo hold seal, and a navigation circuit ground fault." He paused. "I taught Serev the thermal relay recalibration procedure in full detail. She can teach her crew." Silene looked at him. "You taught her the fix," she said. "I am not going to be here every season," he said. "If she can do it herself, the problem stays solved." "If only I can do it. The problem is one transport breakdown away from returning." The way she looked at him in that moment was something he had been watching accumulate across 6 months. Not the searching, measuring expression of their first days, but something that had replaced it, settled in where the searching used to be. Warmer, more certain. The look of someone who had stopped expecting the evidence to eventually contradict the conclusion. On the transport home, they sat across from each other in the small lounge. She had a policy document. He had a maintenance log from the central infrastructure database of one of the other 11 worlds, which Verath had finally provided in the full, unedited form he had asked for, and which had taken 3 weeks of patient requesting to actually receive. They did not talk for 2 hours. It was good silence, working silence, the kind that exists between people who have established that not everything needs to be said. "Varesith was correct," she said eventually. "He usually seems to be," Calvin agreed. "Dreven's coalition formally collapsed yesterday," she said. 4 councillors withdrew their support. The formal vote failed. "What reasons did they give?" She set the document down. "One said she had spent 3 months observing your maintenance work on the palace systems, and had concluded that any consort genuinely invested in whether the drainage infrastructure was functioning correctly was not going to be easily leveraged into a scandal. Her exact phrasing was that a person that focused on the drains cannot be cheaply distracted." "That is probably accurate," Calvin said. 2 others cited favorable reports from outer colonies where you had done repair work, documented improvements, held over time. In one case, the fix prevented a production failure that would have materially affected a colony's annual trade position. "The atmospheric processor on Veth Colony," he said. He remembered it. "Pressure equalization fault, misdiagnosed as a mechanical failure for 8 months before he got there. Once you understood what was actually happening, the fix was straightforward." "The 4th councillor said something different from the others," Silene said. He waited. She was quiet for a moment, choosing, he could tell, in the specific way she chose when something mattered. She said she had been watching us at public functions, and that she had not seen, in 9 years on the council, the Queen appear as though she was not carrying the complete weight of the Dominion alone. The transport hummed steadily around them. Beyond the viewport, stars moved at the slow drift of mid-range travel, not the violent streak of high burn, just the gentle movement of going somewhere at a pace that let you notice the distance. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you still carrying it alone?" She met his eyes. "Considerably less," she said, "significantly less." It was not a declaration in any form that a story would recognize as dramatic. It was something more specific than that, the precise and honest account of a real change in a real situation, offered by a person who did not say things she did not mean and did not embroider things that were already true. He took it for exactly what it was. "There are 3 maintenance issues in the Teth World Infrastructure Log," he said. "I want to go there next week. I have council sessions Tuesday and Thursday and a trade review Friday," she said. "After that, the schedule is open." "Teth World," he said. "Teth World," she agreed. She picked up her document. He picked up the maintenance log. The transport moved steadily through space, carrying both of them toward the same place, both of them working, both of them present. Somewhere between the first conversation on Haveth Station and this quiet evening on a transport home from a small outer colony, something had changed so gradually that neither of them could have located the exact moment of it. The Queen, who had evaluated 43 candidates with patient, exhausted precision, had stopped evaluating. The mechanic who had fixed the coupling for free and wanted nothing in return had discovered that the work he was doing now, 11 worlds of systems that needed maintaining, outer colonies that had been doing without, real problems with real solutions available if someone with the right knowledge showed up, was the largest and most consequential job he had ever taken on, and that he was not doing it alone. He had not gone looking for any of this. He had shown up with his tools because a ship was broken and he knew how to fix it. That was how it had always worked for him. You looked at what was in front of you. You did what it needed. You did not calculate whether it was worth it or whether someone was watching or whether you would get credit for it. You just fixed the thing. Turns out that was the answer to a question someone had been asking for 7 years. Turns out it was exactly enough.